Hi everyone, one hot topic that I keep getting questions about all the time is how do you finish your Ascendancy trials? Especially the third and the fourth one is something that people are looking forward to. I have done this on one of my characters and I think I can give you some valuable input, so I hope this helps you. First of all though, it's important to know where can you even get your points, and for this we have this nice little overview here in the PoE2 wiki. I'll also link this, but you basically have two different paths in order to get your Ascendancies. So there are 4 different Ascendancy trials. You can choose either one of those to get all of those points, and at the end you will have 8 Ascendancy points leading to 4 notables for your Ascendancy. Now keep in mind that the last one is pretty late game. This is pretty high end, so basically when you're like farming tier 15 maps or something like that, at that point you will eventually go there and do this, because these are actually like some of the pinnacle challenges. But at least the third one is relatively accessible. The first 2 you get pretty early in the campaign, and the third one is kind of like late campaign or early maps or so when you can do this, and it's not that crazy, at least for the trials of the Sekhemas. But it can still be pretty tough because they have to go through multiple floors and the trials get pretty tough later on. So to give you a bit of a frame of reference, on my first character, when I didn't really know anything, I did the first 2 right when they unlocked in the campaign, so Act 2, Act 3, and the third one I did when I was like maybe around level 80 or something, or close to 80. So it's already like an end game and mapping and stuff like that. Eventually I finished this 3 floors Jin barrier. And then the last one, well, I completed it, but I had a bug and I couldn't actually get my Ascendancy. But I did manage to defeat Zarok, the Temporal, on the 4th Ascension in Trial of the Sekhemas. I have yet to defeat a Trialmaster, so I can't give you tips on that, but it's also one of the pinnacle challenges, but supposedly easier than Zarok at least, so there's that. But when I did this one, I was already like level 92 or something like that, pretty decked out on my SSF Mercenary, so keep that in mind, it's a pretty tough challenge. So as I said, it's pretty late game. However, I can give you some input here on how these trials actually work. So let's start with the trial of the Sekhemas, which is the first one. So you see right now some footage on my Act 2 clear on my fresh character. Effectively, you have this honor bar here at the bottom, and when this honor bar runs out, you fail the run. So this is important to realize, and you have to kind of dodge every single ability of the enemy. So you try to not get hit as much as possible, because every time you take a hit, you lose some of that honor. Now, there are some bugs right now that makes dot damage extremely strong against honor, and you can easily run out of honor instantly when you have a dot on you. So when there's poisons, there's some traps that release poison clouds. That is getting fixed in the patch very soon, but right now this is not fixed. So keep that in mind. Anything that is a dot, some burn, some bleed, be very careful with that. But other than that, for example, in the first floor here right now, there's very slow enemies. They just shoot projectiles at you. It's kind of easy to get through this as long as you kind of just keep moving, always stay, in movement, and try to avoid these enemies. Most of the time you can even just run past most of them and not really fight them in the first place, depending on which room type you choose, and you don't actually need to get hit very much. Even as a melee character, it's not that crazy, at least for the first Ascendancy. We also have this nice little overview here of the Trials of Ascendancy from CKD on Maxros. I also linked this in the description. You can read up a few more details. But one important thing to know is the room types, because they actually matter quite a lot when you go through the Trial of the Sekhemas. So there's the Gauntlet, which is always just kind of traps and very few monsters, and you have to avoid the traps while also avoiding the monsters. You have to click some levers and then open some door, and eventually you can just exit. You don't actually have to do anything in there other than that. But most of the time the Gauntlet trials are relatively long rooms, and I wouldn't underestimate the traps. As I mentioned, dot damage is pretty dangerous, and sometimes you have these fire traps and these poison traps, and they can instantly drain all of your honor. So be careful with that, and if you can avoid gauntlet rooms, I would recommend avoiding those. But on the other hand, if your character is kind of weak and you have trouble actually fighting monsters in there, then it might be fine if you just kind of like want to take the extra time and avoid those traps properly. Another good thing to know about these traps is also you can actually dodge roll through most of them. So for example, this fire beam, when you dodge roll into it as it approaches you, like if you go in the opposite direction, you can actually just dodge roll through it. And the same applies to some of the other like projectile based traps, for example, that appear on floor 2. And when they're projectiles, you can actually dodge roll through them. So keep that in mind. It actually makes these traps a lot easier to handle. Then we have the chalice trials. I really like those. These are like very small rooms most of the time, where you just like have some monsters that spawn other monsters from a portal. So the challenge here is that you kill these summoners and then the portal collapses and then the room completes. This is usually one of the really fast and easy ones. We have the hourglass trial, where you basically just need to run in a circle for 1 minute and then you win. And if you kill the rare monsters, they it cuts from the timer, so you can actually complete it even faster if you have good damage. But there can be a lot of stuff spawning, so if you're not very powerful, I would avoid these. And then you have the escape trial, which is the easiest by far, where you just run around and you click the death crystals. This looks like this here, so you just have this timer at the top. When the timer runs out, you die, so keep that in mind on hardcore. You probably want to log out if something goes wrong here and the timer is close to the end. But other than that, you kind of just like run through the thing, dodge roll when there's enemies, and this is it. And one thing to keep in mind is also, it always shows you where is the next crystal, or there's multiple crystals sometimes. So try to go in a path that kind of makes sense. Try to like, clean, a full circle around the area, so that you don't get stuck in a corner and there's no crystal anywhere nearby. But most of the time, the escape trials are by far the easiest. You can always see which trial it is here on the map, and you always want to kind of keep that in mind, which trial you have to do. But most of the time, I would recommend to go actually for the right rewards, or at least avoid the wrong afflictions. So rewards that are good early on, for example, in the run, is getting a bunch of Sacred Water. Sacred Water is the currency that you spend at the merchant, and the merchants are really powerful. So whenever you see a merchant and you have a bunch of Sacred Water, like a few hundred or 1,000 or so, I would always go for the merchant unless it has like a really bad downside, because the merchants actually have, buffs that you can choose compared to, for example, just getting a random boon from one of the shrines. And choosing the right buffs can be pretty powerful. There are effects, for example, like you get movement speed, you get extra damage, or the monsters are slower. So there's a lot of really good stuff that you can choose. You can also just kind of restore your honor with some of the Sacred Water they can buy from the merchants. So there's lots of really good stuff. Whenever you can, go for Sacred Water and then for the merchants. Even with the bad room type, I would generally do this, especially at the start of a run with multiple floors. So if you do the later trials of the Sekhemas, you kind of want to stack up a lot of good boons at the start, avoid the really bad boons, get the merchants, and then you can try to kind of complete the later floors much more easily, because they do get very challenging, especially the last one. Sometimes you also have these things here, like the pledge, where you can change the trials parameters, which is usually like you gain one boon, you lose one downside or something like that. So there's like an upside and a downside that you can choose, and sometimes this works in your advantage, but most of the time I don't really find those too crazy. But always keep a lookout for some of these. There's also like a special buff that you can get from one of these. I don't remember what it's called. It's like the Blessing of the Winds or something like that. And that is a very powerful buff that gives you like a boon, and I think like a major boon chance or something like that. So this is a really powerful one and a pretty rare one. In terms of afflictions, one thing you really want to avoid is making monsters faster or stronger or more healthy, or also just something that makes you take damage all the time. So there are some afflictions like that where monsters have more action speed or you have less speed. Like, always avoid this. This is like by far the worst. There's also something where, for example, you get an extra affliction whenever you click on a shrine, or whenever you get another affliction. So this is like a run killer. So definitely avoid that at all costs. But there's also some afflictions that are not really too bad. For example, making room types unknown or something like that. It doesn't really matter most of the time. Yeah, I said that you want to try to look for the good rooms, but I feel like most of the time it's good to go for the rewards more than for the room types. So keep that in mind. Just make sure you don't really buff the monsters too much, or don't buff the bosses too much, because especially the boss fights later on in the later floors, they could get pretty tough. But sometimes you get afflictions that don't really do anything. So in my case, for example, when I have an armor-based build or an energy shield-based build, then you obviously can take something like this here, no problem. And even if you have, let's say, a good reward in a certain room, but you have a really bad affliction, I would generally focus on avoiding the bad affliction more than I would go for the reward. Let's talk about the boss fights a little bit in Trial of Sekhemas. If you're gonna go all the way to the 4th floor, there are 4 different bosses, 1 for each floor, and they get quite a lot harder every single time. So the first one is Rattlecage. He's pretty simple. Just try to avoid his AoEs. He does like some storms and there's some big explosions, so always try to stay at a distance when he does that. Then he does these volcanic fissures, so try to avoid that. And there's also some cave-in. So this is like a pretty simple boss. As long as you kind of stay in movement and stay away from him, you're kind of fine. As a meta character, you have to like dance around a little bit and just pay attention whenever he does like a big charge up. That usually means that there's going to be some AoE. You have to run away for a little bit and come back. At the end of floor 2, we have these twin statues that come out. There's one fire and one cold guy. If you kill them both at the same time, you can actually just finish the fight much easier and much earlier. But if you can't really avoid killing one earlier than the other, then the other one will heal, gain extra abilities, and the room becomes deadly with extra traps shooting stuff from you from all sides. So I would really recommend trying to kill them both at the same time, or you have like a few seconds basically. If you don't, then yeah, it gets pretty tough. You see here, for example, that you can get blasted pretty hard by some of those traps. I almost got one tapped here by one of these, and you really have to avoid this stuff then, and you have to avoid the boss abilities while avoiding the traps from the side. So you have to pay attention to both, and this gets pretty deadly pretty fast. Other than that, these guys are actually pretty slow, so it's relatively easy to avoid these things, at least as a ranged character. You can kind of just like dance around the room and really focus your attention on these, for example, icicles that keep being shot into the center all the time. So rather avoid those more than you focus on the boss, because the boss doesn't really do much. As a melee character, this can get pretty tough though, so you should really pay attention to killing both of them at the same time, and then you can kind of complete the fight very easily. Then we have the third boss, this is the Scorpion in floor 3. So if you want to get your third Ascendancy done, this boss is not really too hard if you know what to avoid. So he has a bunch of like big melee slams, and the roll that you just saw, you kind of need to make sure that whenever he does any of those charged up abilities, you roll away from in front of him and just try to avoid those big hits here. So he does like one big tail swipe, he does the big tail slam, and he does the roll. These are like some of his main big hitting abilities. But there are also some ranged abilities. So at some point he's gonna start digging into the ground and follow you around. You have to kind of just like run circles through the room. And sometimes he goes into turret mode and shoots poison darts at you, which can be pretty deadly as well. So this is this moment here, usually after a roll, where he goes into turret mode, and then he shoots these poison globes. And you also have to be careful to not walk over the poison that is on the ground, because as I explained earlier, the dots are currently really overtuned, and you see how fast it drains my honor. Even though I'm taking like 0 damage right now and I have full honor resistance, it just like depletes all of it right now. So be careful with that, and I wasn't aware of these poison puddles here, so I almost failed the run. At the same time, there's also these pressure plates here. These are part of the floor 3 gauntlet rooms as well. So when you step over them, there will be poison clouds coming out of these. So as you're kiting around the room, try to avoid these, because they will kind of like deny you from going into this area for a long time. These poison clouds stay a long time, so try to not step on them at all. And finally, we have Zarok the Temporal. This is the final boss in floor 4. This is a huge step up to all of the other bosses. In fact, the entire floor 4 is a huge step up to everything else. So if you think you're getting through the first floors really easily, floor 4 is much harder than everything else. So keep that in mind. So you might think that you have a really good run on your hands, and in floor 4 everything can go to shit basically. So if you don't have really good boons, or you have some big downsides that make the enemies harder or something like that, this can be a huge problem here. This is actually what I had. I didn't have any damage buffs at this point. I only had the movement speed buff, and I also had like a affliction that made the enemies tankier and stuff like that. And this fight was an absolute drag. I fought this guy for 15 minutes and eventually killed him without running out of honor, which was, I don't know how that happened, but I managed to do it. But if you are not a ranged character, or you don't like manage to dodge the bullet hell for 10 minutes straight, then this can be really rough. So this guy has a bunch of projectiles he throws at you. So you want to try to dodge these. So there's like these orbs floating through the room all the time. He also throws these boomerangs, and he also throws more orbs all the time. So he does a lot of stuff where you just need to like kind of be on your toes and dodge around. You can dodge through those projectiles. This is not really the big problem. The bigger problem comes from some of his phases that he does later on. So one of these is the clock. So you see this here, he disappears, and then you have to walk into the center, and then you have a time stop where a few bubbles appear, and you have to run and collect all those bubbles as fast as you can. It looks like this. It shows you quickly at the start where you need to go, and you have to collect all of these, because you get a stacking slowing debuff. You see this in the top left right now. It kind of ramps up a slow, and every time you collect one of those bubbles, you get a reduction of the slow debuff. And after you have collected all of them, this trial is over. And you see the clock in the middle. When it turns one time, you die at the end. So this is basically the challenge here. You need to try to collect them in the right order so they don't get slowed too much, and then you can finish this. And another hard part of this encounter is also this rotating chain lightning that he does. So he spawns these bubbles here on the ground, and these are like time stops. So if you step into them, you get frozen for like 3 seconds, and then he starts this like chain lightning, and he turns around 3 times. So I have to do 3 circles around him, trying to avoid all of those bubbles here. And there's more and more appearing all the time. As you see here, I stepped into one and I actually got hit. Now it turns out if you have a tanky character, it's not too bad. I lost a little bit of honor and a bit of life, but you can kind of tank through it. So I did this really bad here because I was unprepared for this. And you can also, if you don't feel like very confident to actually go around an entire circle. It can be pretty tough if you don't have a fast character. You can just dodge through this thing and you take very minimal damage. So that is also an option. You can kind of like just go into it and accept that he takes some damage, instead of just trying to get frozen and then you take a lot more damage because he just hits you with the full attack. The rest of the fight is pretty tank and spank, I would say. So there's like a few things that he throws out, like there's like this slow time bubble that makes you slower. There's also this clock that reverses your time and resets your position to a few seconds ago. But other than that, the fight just gets a bit more intense over time. And as long as you avoid getting killed by the chain lightning or by the clock trial, then you're fine on this fight. Now let's talk about the Trial of Chaos. This is the other option to get your Ascendancy points. You have to do one of them in Act 3 anyway, and then later on you can choose this to get your third and your fourth Ascendancies as well. So you either have to do a 10-wave trial to get your third one, or you have to defeat a Trialmaster, which you get after the 10-wave trials and collecting the 3 fragments to then fight the boss. Now I have not done a Trialmaster yet, so I can't give you tips on that, but I can give you tips on the trial itself. So there are always like a certain set of rooms and certain trials you have to do. There's like one you have to survive for a while, like this one here. There's one where you have to escort a statue. There's one you have to just kill all enemies. There's one you have to find a soul cores, and a few other little things like that with a few bosses mixed in. So at 4, 7, and 10 trials, you each get a boss. So in the end, you have to defeat 3 bosses in one go. And there's exactly 3 bosses, so you will defeat all of them in the 10 trial run. Now, the trials themselves are not necessarily really that crazy. As long as you don't die, you're fine. There's no honor system like in the trials of the Sekhemas. So you can get hit as much as you want. You don't have to worry about this. As long as your character lives, you will not fail this. But there are much harder afflictions you can take on that will actually very easily kill your character. So let's talk about those. So after every room, you choose some of those afflictions here, and some are definitely worse than others, and it will depend a little bit on your build. So certain things buff monsters, like this one here, for example, monsters that inflict bleeding and poison, which I find to be one of the easier ones. But also keep in mind that these things buff the bosses, and the bosses are actually pretty challenging here, at least some of them, and you don't necessarily want to buff them too much. So if you can handle it, you want to try to take some stuff where you just have to dodge around a little bit, and then maybe something that maybe slows you down or makes the character a little bit weaker, but not necessarily makes the monsters much stronger, because they can get really deadly. Now this also depends on how strong is your build, what level of trial do you do. You can, for example, try to do like the lowest level trial that has the 10 rooms for you in order to get through this more easily, because the monster is going to be lower level and easier. Or you can look for afflictions that don't really matter. So for example, if you're playing like a melee build, and you might not really worry about something like lessened reach, where you have less AoE and less projectile speed, for example. Or if you're playing like Spark, then maybe this doesn't really matter, for example. But there's also stuff like minus resistances, so this is very deadly. So this is something you kind of want to avoid, because minus res is rough. There are also a bunch of afflictions that make the whole thing into a bit of a bullet hell, but there are some that are way easier than others. One of them is Volatile Fiends. I would always take these over most other afflictions, honestly, because you know when it's coming. You kill a monster and then the thing appears and it follows you around and explodes when it reaches you, so you can kind of like bait it somewhere, dodge all away, and you're fine. And also it doesn't do anything on bosses, so I like taking this one, for example. Then you have the Stormcaller runes. This is one of those that is kind of like mid-tier, I would say. Depends a bit on the build. If you're melee, it might be a bit harder, but I don't really find those too problematic, as long as you actually don't stand in them and get surprised by them when they appear. So when you can pay attention, there's like little red circles that spawn on the ground. If you step on them, they will kind of charge up, or after some time, they will just like go off automatically, and they will just like do some lightning strikes. Those hurt quite a lot, but they're also easy to bait. And for example, we have the burning turrets. So there's like turrets that constantly fire projectiles. This is some stuff that I would avoid. There's also something like the petrify statues that are really annoying that I will also avoid. But there's also some other stuff like the globes that spawn and then like drop on you. Very easy to bait, and I will always go for these as well. So TLDR, I would say, for most of these afflictions, the AoE stuff or ground stuff, or something that buffs monsters but not the bosses, is usually pretty good. And anything that shoots like beams or projectiles at you, or like debuffs your res or your speed, I would definitely avoid. And then we have the 3 bosses. The first one here is Balak, the Sky Seer. This is also by far the hardest one of these, because he has kind of a one-shot. You see this animation right now, actually. This is the feather swarm that he shoots, and this one is basically a one-shot. I think this is buggy, or at least overtuned, but if you get hit by this thing, then the run is basically over. So there are a few things to do here to can avoid this. So you can either just dodge roll away from it. I think you can even dodge roll through it because it's a projectile, so you should be able to avoid it that way. But if you get hit by this, and you're most likely dead, even on a pretty tanky character. So pay attention to this animation. You see this here, he swings his arm and then he shoots out the feathers, and you want to make sure that you get away from this. He also does a bunch of other pretty deadly abilities. For example, he spawns tornadoes that really hurt, so you won't get hit by this. And he also spawns kind of like a line of like feathers that shoot through the entire room that you also want to avoid. So as the fight progresses, it gets more intense, and especially if you have a lot of these void zones, like you see here with the deadly lightning, it can actually deny you from going into certain places, and you have to like walk through the AoE beams and stuff like that. So just be careful with that. Other than that, this fight is not too hard. I think he doesn't really hit too hard in melee range, for example, as a melee character. So you kind of try to dance around him. You can also, for example, dodge behind him when he does the feathers, and then you're kind of fine. Then we have Oxmal, the Beast Lord. This is the Chimera boss. This is probably the easiest boss, but he's just very annoying. So he constantly flies away and lands somewhere else in the arena, so I have to go find him again. And it can be pretty tough to re-engage him. So this is really the hardest part about this fight, trying to re-engage him and doing a bit of damage before he disappears and flies off again. But other than that, he throws some fire at you, he throws some lightning at you, he does like a bunch of cold attacks, and also he shoots poison from his tail, which is probably his most deadly attack. So he charges up his tail and then shoots like a barrage of poison projectiles where you just need to keep running until it is over, because it follows you around and it actually hurts quite a lot. Most of the other stuff on the boss here is pretty easy to avoid though, so I wouldn't really worry about this one. And lastly, we have Chetza, which is like this other bird here. There's like the fat bird that sits on the ground. He is also not really too deadly. It's just kind of like dodge around him. I don't think he does really anything that bad besides like doing some kind of hard-hitting, slow attacks here and there and throwing some stuff at you. But the one thing is the Plagueling. So this is something you want to kill as fast as possible. He spawns like this little ad here, and this is actually kind of the dangerous part of this fight. Other than that, you can kind of just like roll around him or run around him in a circle, and he doesn't really do all that much. And once you defeat the last boss in a 10-wave trial, you get these victorious fates. So you have to collect all 3 of these pieces every time you get one, and it's random which one you get. So I managed to do more than 3 runs in order to actually challenge the Trialmaster. But then after you have gotten all of these, you get those 3 pieces and you can go to fight the Trialmaster, and this is where you get a 4th Ascendancy. So I think Trial of Chaos is probably generally the easier one to do, especially if you have a strong character, because you don't have to deal with the honor system in the Trial of the Sekhemas. And Trial of Sekhemas is just kind of long. Trial of Chaos is kind of like a shorter run, and yeah, you have to do multiple of those, but it's just generally more easily completed than the Trial of the Sekhemas with the 4 floors, and if you fail on the last floor or on the final boss, then you have to go through the whole thing again. And here it's not really that bad if you fail a run. And with all 3 pieces, after the 10-wave trial, you can go here to the Trialmaster's tower, you put in the 3 little fragments, and then you can open a tower. But as I said, I haven't done it yet. So these are pretty much all of the important tips that I can give you. There's more little details in here if you want to read up on it. So I recommend you go check out this Trials of Ascendancy guide, and hopefully this helps you out in order to get your last Ascendancies done. So let me know how it goes. Also, if you're worried about some bugs with some of the Ascendancies, I think those have been mostly fixed. So this was a problem in the first week of the early access where, for example, I completed the Sanctum, like the Trials of Sekhemas, and I did not get my Ascendancy actually. I'm still at only 6 points, not 8 points, even though I did kill the final boss. But there was a bug where the portal just didn't spawn to click the Ascendancy altar at the end. So this has all been fixed as far as I'm aware, and you don't really have to worry about this anymore. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I wish you good luck on your Ascendancy, and I'll see you guys next time.